Hi, my name is Noah Henson. I'm going to be reading from Genesis chapter 32, verses 1 to 4. When the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. "Come on," they said, "make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt." So Aaron said, "Take the gold rings from the ears of your wives and the sons and your daughters and bring them to me." And all the people took the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and molded it into the shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, "O Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt."
We followed the people of Israel for some time now as we've been studying the book of Exodus. We followed the major things that God's done for him. We've seen that when they were in slavery, God heard their call. We've heard that when he delivered them from Egypt, he did so amidst the plagues on the Egyptians, who were a very powerful government, very powerful people at that time. And then when they were getting away from the Egyptians, they were trapped, remember, between the sea and the Egyptian army. A giant threat and an immovable object. And they thought they were done for. And God rescued them by splitting the waters of the sea and allowing them to walk through on dry land. And then when the Egyptians tried to follow, God collapsed the water in on them and destroyed their army. Then we followed them to Mount Sinai, where they heard God speak from the mountain. We talked about how he delivered the 10 commandments from the mountain of God. And they heard each commandment given. And they heard him talking about what he expected of them and what he wanted for them. If we could start with that first slide, that'd be great. And what God wanted for them was for them to be his people. For that, he had chosen them out of all the people of the world, starting with Abraham and then Isaac, and then on down into the line, Jacob and Joseph. Continuing to choose them as his people, and now this people comes out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, and God says, "I've chosen you to be a holy nation, a royal priesthood. You are mine." And then God made his dwelling within them. Man, if they couldn't remember the waters of the sea parting before them, you would think that they could remember that voice coming from the mountain that sounded like thunder. In fact, it was so terrifying to them, you remember that they asked Moses when he came down, "Please ask God to just speak to you, because when he talks to us, it scares us to death." You would think they would remember that, but the event that Noah just read this morning took place within a few months, within probably a month or so of that voice coming from the mountain. How does that happen? How do we forget things, big things that take place in our lives? There are a lot of moments that have happened in history that if we were alive for them, I bet we remember them. You probably, if you were alive, for instance, the morning, I think it was a Sunday morning, that the news came out about the invasion of Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, you probably remember something about that day, even if you were very young. How many were around and remember something about that day? A few of you. All right. You remember, you may not remember exactly, but you remember that was a big day, that something had happened there that had a huge impact. Most of us remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Most of you who were alive and aware, I was alive but not aware. I was about a month and a half at that point in time. Shannon's a little older than me. He may remember that, but he's got 2 or 3 months on me. But several of you remember that when that was announced, when that happened, you know what you were doing. How about when September 11th happened? Most of us were around for that, and we remember. I was driving my kids to school, and I remember the news coming over the radio as something was going on in New York City. and how that story, how that went out through the day. A lot of things happen like that. And again, we remember what takes place. It was an important event that happened in Arkansas on this day in 1998. Do you remember what that was? The Jonesboro school shooting happened on this day in 1998. And some of you, again, may have had some connections with people up there. I know my brother lives in Paragould, and he knew someone in the family of someone who was actually killed that day. Big impact, big event, and we know that that led to a lot more things. The shooters at the time were 11 and 13. I mean, you remember the shock of learning that, how just absolutely and utterly amazing that was. You just wonder how someone that young gets that far away. Incredible events. And yet our human minds are frail. Because while we remember the event, we may even remember where we're at, we lose the impact of it. We lose the impact of what may have happened that day. We remember that it happened, but we don't remember that kick in the gut feeling that we might have had when that took place. Same are true with personal tragedies, although those tend to hang on a little longer. Same are true with personal victories. We all remember our wedding, what that looked like. Lenore and I actually had an opportunity to sit down and watch the video of our wedding. We bored a bunch of people with it last night. But I had tears in my eyes when it happened because I was able to see that day and remember those events, and that is important. Because before I watched the video, I remembered the day. I remembered what happened. But it wasn't until I watched it that I felt it. Felt what happened. That's important for the Israelites moving forward. It's why before they even stepped foot across the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, however we want to render that, before they stepped foot across that, God said, listen, I want you to remember this event, they're being freed from Egypt with a feast, a festival, Passover. I want you to be able to remember this because God knows how frail the human mind is. And yet we come to this moment in Exodus, this golden calf moment, when the people who had crossed the Red Sea, the people who had witnessed the fire and the cloud leading them, the people who had heard the voice from the mountain giving them the 10 Commandments, the very voice that says, you shall not make an idol or a graven image or however you want to put that, of any kind. Don't do it. And yet in this situation, they did. What happened? What happened that allowed that to take place? What happened that they remembered the voice and what it said, but they chose to do something different? I have a theory. And again, you can't prove this by the text, but reading into the text and reading other accounts of what happened here, I have a theory. Moses had been on the mountain after God spoke from the mountain. Moses had been on the mountain over a month. That's a long time. Over a month. And the people had been down there. We get the sense that Aaron wasn't quite the leader that Moses might have been. Didn't have the same confidence or fear of the people. And he was down there trying to keep things going and trying to keep people happy and that kind of a thing while Moses was up on the mountain. If you've ever worked with a group of people, you know that if you leave them with little or nothing to do for more than a few hours, they're going to start wondering what's going on. I have a sense that the people didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what was going to happen. And not knowing what's going to happen next leads to uncertainty. What are we doing here? What's going on? All right? When you're on a trip, right, the kids in the back are saying, when are we going to get there? Are we there yet? That's the phrase. And the people of Israel, and you remember the number? How many of them are there again? If we get the numbers right there, how many? Yeah, between 1.5 and 2 million people. That's not a small group. And these people have been sitting there for a month waiting for Moses to come back. I get the sense that the fire and smoke is still going on up on top of the mountain, but they hadn't seen Moses in a long time. They didn't know where he was. Not knowing brought uncertainty. Uncertainty always breeds discontent. And I think that's where they were. I think they were uneasy, unsettled. Let's just do something. It's better than nothing. You kind of get that sense, don't you? And this is what they did. Again, in Exodus chapter 32, let's read on from where Noah left off, starting in verse 5 of that chapter. So the people had just said, make us gods, and the Hebrew number is uncertain there. I would say it's more likely to be make us a god. They're not sure whether that's plural or not. And I would say it's better rendered, make us a god who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. Verse 5. Then let's skip down to verse 5. After Aaron had made the calf and said, this is your God, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Then the Lord said to Moses, go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt, they've become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I've commanded and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They've bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, these are your gods, or this is your God, Israel, who brought us up out of Egypt. I've seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. Lord, he said, why? Why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it is with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn your anger, your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster upon your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Then the Lord relented and did not bring his disaster upon his people as he had threatened. Moses turned and went down the mountain with the two tablets of the covenant law in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, the front and the back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, there's a sound of war in the camp. Moses replied, it's not the sound of victory. It's not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them into pieces at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf and he made the people had made, and he burned it with fire, and ground it in powder, and scattered it in the water, and made the Israelites drink it. I would say easily that from a very, very high point, the crossing of the Red Sea, the hearing the voice of God on Mount Sinai, that this very quickly turned into a low point in the history of Israel. They went from a high to a low very, very quickly. Other biblical writers would later remark at how bad this was, at how awful this sin was that the Israelites committed before God. It went from bad to worse after he ground the idol up and put it in their water to drink. It said that he confronted Aaron, and Aaron made up some story about how he threw the people's gold into the fire and out came a calf. And then when Moses turned to the people, they continued to be out of control. And he said, who's with me? And the Levites came to him. Remember, the Levites were the tribe of Levi, and they had been given the responsibility of upholding the worship to God. They were set aside as holy men. And they came to Moses' side. He said, strap on a sword, and I want you to go into the crowd and bring order out of chaos. And the Bible says that they did that, killing many, many people. 3,000 is what we're told, in order to regain or reclaim that sense of order within the crowd. Tough days. Tough days. Then Moses goes back to God and asks him to relent and to continue to move forward with his plan. And God was resistant at first. So I don't know if I want to do this. I mean, I'll let you go, but I don't know if I even want to go with you. And Moses again begs him to go with them. He says, if you're going to blot their name out of your book, take mine out too. Moses was a great mediator between the people who were rebellious and God. The name stiff-necked, I always thought of having a stiff neck and not being able to turn, but I was corrected when I read in a commentary about this. It says stiff-necked referred to a horse or a mule or an ox that couldn't be turned. And you think about how they turn them with the reins, you turn their neck, right? But if they're stiff-necked, that means they're going to go where they want to go. Maybe you've had an animal do that to you at some point in time if you have that kind of familiarity. And you know what that means. And that's what God's saying about these people. They just want to do what they want to do. They're not listening. God agreed to continue with his plan. And on they went. But this event would continue to be a blight. It would continue to be a mark against them. It would continue to be a point to where prophets later, leaders of Israel would later look back and say, do you remember that? That was a low point. We can't do that again. We can't get to the point to where we disregard God's commands and just do what we want. I want to talk for a minute just about that calf. I'm going to see if this works. There we go. I'm going to go one more, though. Talk for a minute about that calf, the golden calf that they made and what it was. There are several different theories about it, and I had to work to kind of wrap my mind around it a little bit. Nobody has this is for sure what it was. 3 different theories that I read, and I have one that I like better than others. But one is that it was an Egyptian god. It was a god that they would have encountered in Egypt, and they were going to worship this god and have this god lead them. Another says that it was a bull god named Apis. I'm not sure how it's said. But that god apparently was a god that that had a supernatural ability to travel between the world of the gods and the world of man. And that the gods could literally come from the world of the gods on the back of this bull and bring them to him. In that sense, the idea would be is that they wanted this bull to carry their God. They weren't worshiping another God, but to carry their God back to them and lead them forward. That's another theory. The third one, and this is probably my favorite, this is probably the one I think makes the most sense to me, is that they meant that God, that the bull was a representative of their God, of the Lord, of Yahweh. And it wasn't unusual that a bull would be used as kind of an icon for any god whose greatest virtue was strength. Bulls were considered icons or symbols of great strength. And so anything that was represented by a bull was something that was strong. And it could be here that bull was meant to represent God, the God of the Israelites. And that when Aaron said, here is the God who led you out of Egypt, he meant this is the representation of our God, the God that was on the mountain. And when he built an altar before this God, they were offering sacrifices to their God. It wasn't another God, but they were offering sacrifices to the God of Israel. That's what they really wanted. But there was an Egyptian flavor to it, because this is something that was typical of what they would have seen in Egypt. It was also, the way they worshiped it was also typical of what they would have seen in Egypt. Just because they may have done it for their own God, just because they may not have been turning their attention to other gods, doesn't mean they were doing the right thing. Clearly, they were not doing the right thing. God had clearly stated, I don't want you to build any idols. And that meant for another god or for him. That was wrong. Later in 1 Kings chapter 12, Jeroboam was separating, he separated, he was the king under the division of the kingdoms, the Israel and Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. Jeroboam was the king. He separated the kingdom from Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. And instead of allowing the people or encouraging the people to go to Jerusalem to worship, because Jerusalem was in the southern kingdom of Judah, he feared that if they did that regularly, that they would want to serve the king that was in Jerusalem again, Rehoboam. And so Jeroboam set up 2 calf idols at the southern border of his nation, set up 2 idols for them to worship. One at the southern, one may have been north. But these idols, of these idols, he said, "Here, Israel, is your God that led you out of Egypt." Sounds familiar. Again, the idea being that it's possible that this was a representation of their God, of the God of Israel. And so, again, if that's true, maybe, may not, you may have your own theory on what that represents, and that's all fine and good. We may never know for sure exactly what it was. What we do know for sure is that it was a sin, that it was what they should not have done. It was what God had specifically asked them not to do, and yet they find themselves here in the place where they build this calf idol, and they're worshiping this calf idol. It's a tricky place that they've come to. A place where they're considering where they're going to go. Are we going to follow this Moses guy and his view of God, or are we going to try to take control and do things ourselves? And it's clear in this situation, they're trying to take control in a situation where they felt out of control. They're trying to hold on to the control of their destiny, of where they're going. Here's a question that if you fancy yourself a Bible scholar, here's a question for you. They said when we build this, they asked Aaron to build this God who would go before them. Where are they going? Where are they going to go? I mean, God had led them in the cloud. Where were they planning to go? Later on, Nehemiah is going to make a statement that kind of gives us a clue on that. They were looking to go back to Egypt. We know later on when they look at the promised land, they spy out the promised land. You remember when the 12 spies came back and gave a report? 10 of the spies said, there's no way, these people are too numerous and too big, we can't take them. 2 of them said, oh yeah, with God we can do anything. And they decided not to at that point in time. It was at that point in time when the people rebelled that the Bible actually tells us that they appointed a leader to take them back into slavery. Can you imagine that? Where do you have to be to make the choice to go back into slavery? What causes that kind of behavior? And the answer is one word: fear. Fear causes that kind of behavior. They were afraid of what lay ahead because it was uncertain. They hadn't yet put their trust in God, that's obvious. And they were afraid. And so out of fear, they thought it better to turn back, to submit themselves to the Egyptians again, and make bricks. We can just do that. Why? Making bricks are predictable. They know how to do that. They know what that looks like. They can do that all day long. Food was predictable in Egypt. They knew they were going to be fed every day. Their life, it was terrible, awful. They could be mistreated and killed at will there. but at least they knew what to expect. Moving ahead, they had no idea. Whether it be moving ahead into the wilderness or moving ahead into the promised land and doing what they were going to have to do to take over that, it was unfamiliar territory, uncharted ground. We have no idea what that looks like. Let's just go back. You know, I think since then, the people of God have been at that crossroad many times. The people of God have been at a place where moving forward is scary. We're following God into uncharted territory, into the unknown. It's scary. When it came time for them to, when they were under the judges, the rule of the judges, and Samuel was one of the great judges at that time, but they came to Samuel and said, listen, we want a king. We want a king to rule over us like the other nations have because, hey, the king is going to protect us. Implied there, we're not sure God will. They were afraid. They took action. Later, as the people are uncertain as to whether they can count on God, and they turn to idols, and they begin to worship idols, and God's prophets are saying, you can't worship idols. That's against God's law. If you do that, he'll destroy you. And the Israelite says, we'll take our chance with the wood. We'll take our chance with the guys that are carved and just hope that they'll be able to protect us. They were afraid of what moving forward looked like. When Jesus came to this earth and started to share his ministry, started to share what he was looking forward to, started to share the good news about the kingdom of God and what that was supposed to look like. Some people looked at that and were like, oh man, that's great. Can't wait. But the leaders of the Israelites at that point in time, the leaders of the Jews, looked at that and said, your view, your vision of our future is scary. And we want nothing to do with that. Your vision of our future seems like I don't see any way around it other than it's going to have a lot of war, a lot of conflict, a lot of people are going to die, our temple's going to be taken away, and we're going to lose everything if we do things your way. So we're not going to do it that way. Fear. And fear is what drove them to put Jesus on the cross. Thankfully, that was God's plan that time, actually. That's what he planned for. He knew that their fear would take them to that point. In the book of Mark, as you read through Jesus' last few days in Jerusalem, you can see him ramping up the rhetoric. He rides in on a donkey that fulfills messianic prophecy. All of them would have recognized what Jesus was doing at that point in time. And you can see the Jewish leaders, metaphorically anyway, chewing their fingernails. Man, they were nervous about that. They went straight to the temple. What did he do there? Drove the animals and the sellers, the money changers out of the temple. He cursed a fig tree. He had negative things to say to the Pharisees. I mean, you read that, you think, man, did he just get up on the wrong side of the bed? What's going on with him here? Jesus is looking grumpy. But he wasn't grumpy. That was a part of the plan. He was stirring up their fear because he knew what was supposed to happen there. They feared. They did what they did. And he did what he did. He died for all of their sins, for all of their fears, for the sin of putting him on the cross, as well as for the sin of building that stupid idol in the wilderness. He died for all of that. He gave his life so that we would never have to fear again. And yet, as people of God, we continue to come to times that are fearful. As we look forward, we read the statistics, we know what's happening in our culture in terms of faith, religion, Christianity. We see what's happening among our own tribe, where the numbers in churches of Christ seem to be moving down. That produces uncertainty. It produces fear. And what does fear make us do? Well, it makes us do the same thing they did. It makes us want to take control. It makes us want to do what we think is right instead of just following the cloud. Following God. Doing his will. You know, we talked in class this morning. Daryl led a great class in our Church on Mission class about the history of Westside and kind of where we've come and the ups and downs that we've experienced as a church body over time. And it's clear that as we look ahead, there's uncertainty. There are people among us who have made choices to go different directions. We've hit some financial rough spots, and that makes the way ahead seem uncertain and unsure. But as we learned from the Israelites, now is not the time to take control ourselves. Now is not the time to say, hey, what about that idol? What about that calf? Now is not the time to think Tim knows what's best. Now is the time for us all to be on our knees asking God where you would have us go. I don't know all the answers to that, but I do know that his mission continues to be the same. His mission continues to be to take his kingdom to a world that needs it, a world that is very different than the world I grew up in, and becoming more and more different each day. Listen, I'll be honest, I want this church to be relevant to everybody here today and everybody who considers themselves a member of Westside. I want this church to be relevant. I want them to think about what we're doing throughout the week. I want them to continue to feel proud to invite their friends, their relatives, their associates to church, to come to church here and to experience what we have here at Westside. What we have is great. Keeping the church relevant to our members is really, really, really important. But it's not what keeps me up at night. I want that very badly. But what keeps me up at night is when I look around at some of the babies in our auditorium. Jeff and Lauren are holding a little guy back there that's just as cute as he can be. And in my mind, I ask the question, roll this forward 20 years, and what do we have to look like for him, for this church to be relevant? How does this church become relevant for him? Again, I don't think that means changing how we look at Scripture. I'm not saying that at all. I don't see that. But I do think it means learning what our culture around needs. Learning what our culture around us needs, and especially those who are going to keep this thing rolling into the future. Who are going to keep us moving in the direction that God is leading, not Tim. Tim just prays that every day that I can follow God's leading. That I can follow the cloud. That I can follow the good shepherd. And I do so without question. That's what I want to do. I want to follow him without fear, knowing that where he's leading is the right direction. I don't have all the answers as to exactly what that looks like, but I do know that it's important for us, for our children, for our grandchildren, for our great-grandchildren. How do we hand this to them and say, listen, here we've taught you, we've shown you the cloud, we've shown you the shepherd, follow him. How do we engage them in the mission of the church? How do we show them how important it is to follow Jesus with their whole heart? That's where I want to be. That's what keeps me awake at night. Never want to be irrelevant to us, but I always want to be thinking of what's it going to take to be relevant to them. I invite you to join me on that. To join me on how we engage our kids in the mission of this church. How we teach them to engage their kids in the mission of the church. And continue this dream and vision of Westside many, many, many years into the future. Never looking back. The Israelites could have gone back to Egypt, but they wouldn't have followed God there because God wasn't going there. And he was never heading that direction. we have to be sure that we're following him. That we're following him in mission to take his kingdom to our world. Not the world of yesterday, the world of today, the world of tomorrow, and the world looking forward. That's our challenge this morning. I invite you to join me and others on this mission. And if you haven't begun that mission by taking Jesus as your Lord and Savior, that's step number one. Making him your Lord and Savior, being baptized into his name and risen to walk in a new life, a life that takes his kingdom, that becomes his disciple and takes his kingdom to our world. We ask you to join us in that mission. If you've gotten distracted along the way somewhere, there'll be people standing around, leaders standing around the auditorium who would love to pray with you, whether it's a concern for you or a concern for someone else. They want to pray with you about that concern. It'll remain confidential unless you specifically ask them to share it with the congregation. We just want to be there for you. We want to pray that we can all be on this mission and following that cloud, following the Good Shepherd together. Whatever your need is this morning, we want to be there for you. Zach's got a song he's going to lead to encourage us to do that. We'd ask you to let us know how we can help. Let's stand as we sing this song.